Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's bi-weekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Tim Bartik, senior economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Tim is one of the nation's foremost experts on local and regional economic development. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please identify yourself and your organization as if you were asking your question in person. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website in the near future. And if you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. If you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. And before we get started, I'd like to remind people that tomorrow morning we have a special episode of The Prescription. Our guest will be Senator Rob Portman. We'll be on from 9:15 to 9:45 tomorrow morning. Senator Portman will be talking about President Trump's economic policy agenda. Tim Bartik, welcome to The Prescription. It's great to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Place-based economic development incentives are very controversial. Some think they're a panacea. Others say they interfere with markets and waste taxpayer money. You think they have an important role to play, but that governments often implement them incorrectly. How should they be designed?
Well, my view is we vastly overemphasize handing out cash to firms, either in the form of business tax incentives or in some case straight out cash grants. And the reason I say why we overuse those is that they're not the most cost-effective way of creating local jobs. So my view is that a much more cost-effective way of creating local jobs would be to do things like infrastructure, customized job training, business advice services such as manufacturing extension programs, small business development centers, doing things like research parks or business incubators. That's more effective. That's one problem with these business incentives. The other problem is they're not at all targeted at distressed areas. In other words, basically states are currently, there's some states are high in incentives, some are low. It has no correlation with whether the state's distressed or not. Within states, I was just yesterday, Colorado made 84% of its state enterprise zone. Louisiana, the entire state's enterprise zone. How is that targeting distressed places? It's not. And so the problem is, one, these things don't target distressed places, and two, they're not necessarily that cost effective. There are more cost effective things you can do. So I think we should more sparingly use cash incentives. And when we do use them, we should target distressed places. And frankly, we should recognize if you really want to turn around a place, you need to address its fundamental problems through providing the services that are needed to overcome those problems.
So we often think about economic development and workforce development as living in separate worlds. One focuses on investment incentives, the other on training. And you've argued that they need to be more closely aligned. So give me a specific example. How would that actually work? And can you give me maybe a success story to share?
Well, customized job training is one example. That there are a number of studies showing that customized training programs are a cost-effective way of creating jobs. So customized training, that's a buzzword. What does that mean? It means that when a firm is thinking of locating or expanding in a state, particularly a firm in an export-based sector, the state will say to them, we want you to be here, and as part of our deal, we will basically pay for training for the workers that you're going to hire that will be customized to your firm's needs. And that typically is done through the local community college. Now, the reason why I think that can work is that firms frequently, particularly smaller firms, don't necessarily have their own dedicated training staff, and community colleges has some expertise in how to run training programs. But the reason why it works in terms of getting benefits for the local economy, true benefits, is that the community college in doing this can bring in people into the hiring pool who maybe are not, would not ordinarily be hired. So I think that's a very good program. So to mention like some other example, and who's running good customized training, Massachusetts has some good customized training programs in the manufacturing sector. Actually, Michigan has some good training programs in the manufacturing sector. California has run some good training programs. A lot of places have customized training, and they're varying quality. It varies a lot with the local community college and how good they are at doing this. On the workforce side, you can do programs that I think programs that work with employers tend to be more effective. So, for example, in Southwest Michigan, the Upton Institute, in addition to being a research organization, runs some services, job training services in the area. We run these employer resource networks that basically newly hired workers are provided with some social work services. Say if their car is not working, they can get access to a low interest loan to get their car repaired. So this helps these smaller businesses retain these disadvantaged workers who otherwise they might not be able to retain. So I think more effective workforce development programs don't just train someone and send them off in the workforce. They work closely with employers on overcoming problems. And so I think both economic development and workforce development are more effective if they work with each other.
So how can these programs be more widely replicated? It sounds like they're scattered around the country, but what can we do to replicate them more widely?
Well, I mean, I guess the direct approach would be the federal government could decide to fund some of these at a higher level. I mean, we don't really seriously fund job training at the federal level in this country. We have some job training funds, but not anywhere close to what many European countries do. Or you could say the federal government should, in a more major way. I've proposed recently a federal block grant for economic development that would say, look, we used to do economic development at the regional scale in the U.S. We had TVA, we had the in Tennessee Valley Authority, we had the Appalachian Regional Commission. There's some evidence that both of these programs did a lot of good. Maybe not, they didn't solve all the problems of the Tennessee Valley or obviously Appalachia, but they did increase incomes, provide a lot of jobs. And we could try to do that again. I do think that there's some pressure on states to move in this direction. I think some states have made some cuts in their incentives and have put more money into some of these services. That's happened some in Michigan, for example. Michigan is still a high incentive state, but they were cut back considerably in recent years. And there now has been more money put in some of these customized training programs and business services. So it's a matter of putting pressure. I think at the state and local level, people should put pressure on their state governments to adopt more effective economic development policies.
So let me raise with you what might be the poster child for what not to do. In 2018, with great fanfare, President Trump and then Governor Scott Walker announced that Wisconsin would grant the Taiwanese electronics company Foxconn $3 billion in tax incentives in exchange for its promise to spend $10 billion and create 13,000 factory jobs. Instead, the firm has spent about $300 million and it's hired 281 workers. A couple of weeks ago, the state pulled the plug on the deal, although state and local governments reportedly already have spent $400 million in taxpayer money to procure land, build out infrastructure, and other expenses. So what lessons can we learn from this experience?
Well, the Foxconn is in some sense unique because I think the whole project was probably a fake project from the get-go. It looked to me like it was done for political purposes by Foxconn. And there was a great article at The Verge by Justice Aziza the other day that documented that. The problem is the state offered way too much. That this offer was clearly excessive. I mean, and too much per job. And we need to try to limit things like this. We need to put pressure at the state level to do this, or we need to consider some national standards on this. I mean, Foxconn would have been illegal in the European Union. You could not offer an incentive of that magnitude, even in a distressed region. The EU has rules on incentives to promote regional development. And these rules set limits on percentage of investment or percentage of wage costs that can be subsidized. And the rules are more stringent for large projects, which are the most tempting for governors, for states to do. I mean, the ribbon cutting of a 13,000 job project or a 40,000, it's a huge political thing. And so we need to put some limits on this, and we could imitate the EU and say, look, we can do this to some extent, but let's have limits. Let's make them more stringent in non-distressed areas. Let's make them more stringent on the large projects where the political temptations are greatest. And I think that would be a reasonable thing to do. You could either just simply say that under our interstate commerce power, the federal government can just regulate this, or you could tie it to, say, this new federal block grant that I mentioned. You could say, if you want to get this federal help in economic development, you need to have some reasonable rules on incentives.
I guess one of the issues that comes up a lot is these bidding wars. Of course, Amazon was the classic example of that, which you get states or even cities within states that end up, bidding with one another, to provide a bigger subsidy for the company to locate in their jurisdiction.
Right. And so we need some federal regulation of this. And of course, states also can limit themselves. And I think it's interesting that, Virginia, Northern Virginia, as you know, and I think most the listeners will know, got the project. And, basically Virginia offered, in terms of cash, $800 million, which, was only about $20,000 per job, which in terms of subsidies is not necessarily out of line with what's being done. It was nowhere close to Foxconn, which is over $200,000 per job. And it's interesting that, like, Maryland, I think, offered around $3 billion. And then they chose Virginia anyway, which actually, by the way, just in and of itself indicates that the cash incentive is not the only thing, because they could have located in Maryland and gotten $3 billion rather than $800 million. And but Virginia did a very smart thing. They actually instead said, we're going to use this Amazon deal as a way of getting some new technical colleges set up, some investing more in local infrastructure, improving the metro in that area, improving the highways in the area, and trying to get more workers trained in computer-related fields in Virginia. Now, the reason why that's, first of all, that will help make sure that more of the workers at Amazon are Virginia residents, which is a good thing for Virginia. Secondly, let's say, who knows where Amazon's going to be 30 years from now. Even if Amazon is not the big leader it is today, 30 years from now, investing in these resources that will improve the infrastructure and train workers is likely to pay off long-term for Virginia.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned already that you've proposed a federal block grant program, and it's, I think, 10 years and $128 billion. When I first read about the idea of a economic development block grant program, I flashed back to the old CDBG program from the mid-1970s. But give me an idea, a little more detail of how your version would work.
Well, my version would target the areas that are at least 5 percentage points below the national average in their employment to population ratio or employment rate for so-called prime age workers. That is, workers aged 25 to 54, who are the people we expect to be working in generally. And these distressed areas have about 47 million people all across the US. It's about 15% of the US population. And a lot of them are in the rural South and Appalachia, as you'd expect, but you have Detroit and you have Flint, and you have areas of upstate New York. You have big areas of on the West Coast in California, Washington, Oregon, outside the major coastal booming cities that we hear about in California on the West Coast. There's a lot of more rural or medium-sized cities in from the coast that are really struggling, have very low prime age employment rates. That's a huge problem. And so what this would say to these areas, for the next 10 years, we are giving you aid that is roughly equivalent per capita to what was provided to the Tennessee Valley Authority at its peak, about $300 per capita, if you want to picture that, if you can add that up. And what you would do is you would use these funds to create jobs through some of the ways I said: investing in infrastructure, investing in customized training, investing in business advice services, investing in research parks and other kind of business parks, business incubators, help the small business in the area, workforce training programs linked to all this. And, based on reasonable projections, this would create about 3 million jobs in these areas. It would be enough to lower the employment rate gap between them and the nation by a half. Now, you might say, why should we do that? I would say you should do it because people in these areas need jobs. They have lower job opportunities than other Americans. And, you can say, why not? Shouldn't people just move out? Well, that's not a good solution. I mean, people have ties to the places they live in. And frankly, it doesn't solve problems to tell people to just move out of Flint. If you think that you're going to help Flint, Michigan by telling people to move out of Flint, you're not. People are going to move out of Flint, and the evidence suggests that it will lower jobs in Flint by the same percentage it lowers population. So you're not making anyone back in Flint better off. You're just removing some of the younger people who might actually revitalize the place. So, moving people out of distressed places is not a viable solution. You need to figure out cost-effective ways of increasing jobs in distressed places.
So let's talk a little bit about COVID. The pandemic, of course, has amplified many of the issues that you spend your career talking about. One interesting bit of data that I read that you came up with was you looked at the regional inequality gap driven by the pandemic, and you found that the unemployment gap between the 5 states with the lowest unemployment rate and the 5 with the highest unemployment rate was only about 2.8% in June of 2019, but that gap grew to more than 9% in June of 2020. What's going on here, and how can we address this?
Well, part of it is that we know recessions always raise all kinds of inequalities, and they definitely raise regional inequalities all the time. But I think that in the COVID case, what's particularly the case, the disease has really hit particularly disadvantaged populations, particularly Black people, Hispanic people. It's more heavily hit some of these groups. And other economically disadvantaged groups as well. And so areas that were already disadvantaged, that had high percentage people of color and other disadvantaged groups, were hit harder by this pandemic. And, so I think it's exacerbated our regional inequality problem. And we failed so far to intervene through state and local fiscal aid to really offset this, let alone this long-term development aid I'm talking about. So we're going to have an increased regional inequality problem coming out of this COVID-19 recession.
So Congress and the president have been arguing now for 7 months about a stimulus bill, another stimulus bill. They've gotten nowhere. Give me a sense of, if you were in charge, how you would design this bill. What would you put in it to sort of maximize its effects on the?
I think you need an automatic stabilizer. I mean, people have come up with all kinds of numbers, what the state and local need is, how much revenue has been lost due to this. And it's a moving target because the economy keeps on changing. It went down. Now it's gone up some, but now it seems to be we're having a second wave of the virus, and maybe the economy will go down again. So, trying to predict exactly what the revenue loss will be for state and local governments in fiscal year 21, let alone fiscal year 2022 or 2023, because I don't think this is going to be simply a one-year problem. It's a multi-year problem. If we want to prevent some of what we saw coming in the Great Recession, where there was a serious problem in, say, state university funding, state public school funding for years and years after the peak of the Great Recession, if we want to prevent that, we really need to have an automatic stabilizer, some kind of, countercyclical revenue sharing, which we had in the past in the 1970s. And it needs to be on some formula where I would simply base it on, let's look at the revenue that state and local governments actually collect in fiscal year 2021, 2022, and going forward. Let's see how it compares with reasonable projections, which we could do, of what revenue they would have raised if the economy had proceeded along some modest growth path. And let's decide that the federal government will pay some percentage share of that gap. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say the Fed should pay 100% of the need, but they should certainly pay a sizable share. And let's base it on the actual revenue collected. Let's make an automatic stabilizer based on actual revenue collected, not some magic formula that we think completely describes the economy.
So you mentioned that Black people and Hispanic people have been hurt more by this. The data are pretty clear. They're more likely to lose their jobs and less likely to be rehired. And at the same time, you found that the number of Black business owners declined by nearly 20% from February to June, compared to a 5% decline for white business owners. What do we know about the causes of this, and how should policy makers respond specifically to this issue?
Well, I mean, there could be a wide variety of reasons. First of all, part of it is simply due to who are the essential workers, right? And who are the folks out there? And a lot of them are, relatively low wage workers, relatively disadvantaged workers. And then of course in these neighborhoods, they may not have access to they have to work, they have to put their kid in some kind of childcare. They don't have the option maybe of working remotely. And so they're more exposed to the virus. And also in many cases, they might be living in denser communities where perhaps the risk of virus spread. I'm not sure we completely understand all the factors, but we definitely can see the pattern of who's getting sick and which areas are suffering. And although part of it is travel and tourism dependent areas are suffering, it also is areas that have higher percentage of disadvantaged folks. And we need to deal with that. This is going to cause locally severe recessions cause long-term problems. I mean, they cause long-term problems because people lose their jobs. That causes problems for them. Maybe they develop substance abuse problems. Maybe they lose job skills. They lose credentials. It's hard for them to get rehired. And then also, if it damages local public services, such as education, it can damage the long-run competitiveness of the area. So we need to reckon with that this recession is going to have long-lasting consequences. It's not going to be over quickly, and the sooner we act, the better.
And let me also ask about the piece involving business owners. Black people owned businesses have also suffered disproportionately. What's happening there, do you think?
Well, I think part of it is we haven't adequately responded. I mean, PPP, I think, was not necessarily a bad idea, the payroll protection plan, but it clearly did not target the need adequately. We know that they define small business anything up to 500 employees, and then they use existing banking networks to try to distribute the funds. Some of the banks prefer their larger customers, even their small business, but the larger small businesses. Some of the Black-owned firms may not, for example, may not have had the right bank, connection or had the clout with the bank to get the loan. So I think we need to figure out more flexible ways to try to get more aid out to the truly needy businesses that have been most affected. And we're going to need to do this again, because if we have a second wave, there are going to be a bunch of other businesses that are going to go down that maybe survive the first wave with some aid, but cannot make it through the second wave.
Let me switch gears again a little bit. Another consequence of the pandemic, of course, has been the rise of remote work. I haven't seen my office for 7 months, but you project that this won't be a temporary phenomenon, but that perhaps it's not going to be as dramatic as some people think. Tell me a little more about where you see this going.
Well, first of all, I try to overgeneralize my own experience. So I'm a research economist. I'm working from home. I can work from home pretty readily, but I'm not necessarily the average worker. And even in my field, I mean, I think people will want to go back, and I like talking to my colleagues, and I learn from them, and I like running in the hallways or by the coffee machine, and I miss that. You don't do this, you don't zoom in and talk to a colleague the same way you run into them at the coffee machine. Not the same thing. So I suspect there will be a trend towards remote work, but that people will also people have always been forecasting that the rise of some new communications technology is going to mean the death of cities. You can find forecasts for this going back a long time. The telephone's going to lead to the death of cities. I mean, the car, everything, because people now transportation communication costs are lower. They don't need to all be in the same place. And the advantages of being in the same room and interacting and reading body language and on a regular basis are still going to exist. And therefore, I think that there will be some remote work, but people will also want to gather together. It may not be the same extent. That might affect, say, downtown business districts. Maybe if people only working in person 2 days a week and the remote 3 days a week, obviously less lunch business for local restaurants, for example.
And what about rural communities? They're often forgotten in this. They've been hammered in recent decades. Do you see any opportunities here to improve the economic situation of these rural communities?
Well, yes, if we can get the right infrastructure. I mean, part of what I would hope, for example, this federal block grant would pay for is that rural communities could help invest in improved broadband infrastructure. We need to really get, I mean, obviously we can't necessarily have the same broadband everywhere in the country to every single community, but we can certainly make it more accessible, more broadly accessible than it is now. And that would include not only remote rural communities, but also inner city communities. I mean, we need to view this broadband access as more as a basic public utility that we need to try to extend to as many Americans, just as we did in the past with, say, rural electrification during the 1930s. I mean, that was part of what TVA was doing with all the dams and hydro power projects and that kind of thing. And we need to make an investment in that. And of course, rural communities can also, if there's more remote work, and I do think it will occur to some extent, hopefully they can invest in amenities. I mean, so part of what they need to do to really develop their economies is work on the amenity side and make sure, and a lot of them do have good amenities. I mean, it varies from place to place, but you need to offer good amenities so you can attract workers. I mean, that's going to be one of the keys to economic development in the future is what can you do to attract workers?
So we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to ask you about one other trend that people talk about a lot post-COVID, and that's the rise of workplace technology. Of course, already happening, but bottom line, will more robots replace people faster than we thought they would? And
well, I think that's already been occurring and will continue to occur. I think one of the big challenges of the American economy is a lot of occupations, there will be increased use of robots, whatever. However, we're still going to have personal service jobs of various sorts. And so one of the major challenges I see in the American economy is how do we increase wages and earnings in some of these personal service jobs? And a lot of that has to do with government decisions. I mean, we can talk about things like a higher minimum wage. We could talk about things like, should we have sectoral bargaining? Should we have wage standards? I mean, for example, Medicare and other, you can set standards in Medicare, Medicaid, other programs for what the wages should be, say, in nursing homes or in various other health service occupations. So I think we need to think about how do we increase wages, and to help support that, how do we increase training in the service occupations, because there is going to be still a need for personal services, even if I don't think robots will take over nursing home care, for example.
But what they have been doing, and I guess this will accelerate the trend, is taking over those higher wage manufacturing jobs.
Right. There's going to be definitely that. There's definitely going to be some technology. I mean, with manufacturing, what I hope the U.S. is able to do is to try to adopt policies where we continue to invest in advanced manufacturing and we stabilize roughly the number of jobs in manufacturing. In other words, we don't want to see a recurrence. I mean, usually the manufacturing share of jobs has been going down for a long time, a lot due to technology. What we did have from 2000 to about 2010 or so was this huge drop in the number of manufacturing jobs, which devastated many communities. And some of that was due to technology, but a lot was due to trade and also due to the failure of the U.S. to invest in helping smaller manufacturers through manufacturing extension and training programs to help upgrade the quality of their workforce. I think we could have kept more manufacturing jobs with some more creative policy. In the future, I think we should hope to maybe just stabilize the number of manufacturing jobs, which will of course mean that over time, it will be a lower share of the workforce, but at least it will not be going down, 20, 30, 40% in terms of absolute number of jobs.
We are out of time. To Bartik, thank you so much for taking the time and chatting with us today. It's been very interesting. Again, a reminder to our viewers, a special episode of The Prescription tomorrow morning at 9:15 with Senator Rob Portman. So thanks again to everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.